Right. But how do we answer this question? What's my question? My question is, how long can we keep going?
You are listening to the best tracks selected by DJ Layna.
50% of every protein you put in your body, 50% comes from some plant that was grown using this process. That's how important it is. 50% of every protein you put in your body, 50% comes from this. Comes from some plant that was grown using this process. That's how important it is.
Reminding each other that we're part of a larger self.
The earth is alive.
He synthesized ammonia from nitrogen gas. Even though 78% of air is nitrogen, turning it into useful ammonia fertilizer is extremely difficult. Nitrogen doesn't exist as a single atom. It exists in a largely unreactive form, as two atoms coupled together with triple bonds, the strongest in nature. Triple bonds, the strongest in nature.
-3. You didn't let me finish.
Simply put, it's incredibly hard to break down. It happens naturally, but it's rare, either by lightning pulsing through the air or bacteria slowly eating away at rotting vegetation in the earth. Haber initially tried to mimic a thunderstorm to produce nitric acid, but he only got small amounts, so he began to work with high temperature and high pressure. Germany's largest chemical company, BASF, had engineer Haber-Bosch help Haber turn it from a lab experiment into a commercial process. The team had to invent much of their equipment to handle the extreme conditions and worked in a concrete chamber away from other workers due to frequent explosions. When completed, the Haber-Bosch machine stood nearly 8 meters tall and produced 90 kilos of ammonia per hour. But it wasn't used to create fertilizer, not initially anyway. By 1914, the world was at war. Germany was struggling to manufacture explosives due to shortages of nitric acid. A proud patriot, Fritz Haber became involved in the war effort and began to produce poison gas. In 1915, chlorine and mustard gas at the Battle of Ypres would kill tens of thousands of troops. Haber reportedly watched the field of battle as the gas was released on Allied troops. Haber's wife, Clara Immerwahr, a prominent chemist in her own right, was sickened by his involvement and would commit suicide by shooting herself with Haber's army pistol. Despite effectively becoming the father of chemical warfare, Fritz Haber's achievements in synthesizing ammonia would lead to the award of a Nobel Prize.
Now, it's arguable whether we're doing that sustainably. It's arguable whether we're doing that sustainably. It's arguable whether we're doing that sustainably.
This is because the ammonia that it produces is used to make nitrogen-based fertilizers, which allows to grow all of the food that we need to feed everyone. In order to make such huge amounts of ammonia though, we need a massive amount of nitrogen and hydrogen. The nitrogen is easy to acquire, because 78% of the air all around us is nitrogen, so we just take it from the air.
we know how much the atmosphere weighs. The mass of the atmosphere is something like 5 times 10 to the 21st grams.
Hydrogen, though, is a bit tricky to get hold of, as we have to make it from hydrocarbons like methane. Now, two important things to notice about this reaction are that it produces heat, which means it's exothermic, and that it has a two-way reaction arrow, which means that it's reversible. So some of the ammonia that gets formed will break back down to reform nitrogen and hydrogen.
Saturday through Sunday, Monday through Sunday, yo. Maybe I'll love you one day, maybe we'll someday grow. Till then, just sit your drunk ass on that fucking runway.
Why does this matter? Why does counting and thinking about how much of stuff you're using by using chemistry and moles, why does that matter? Well, let's take an example. Let's take an example of nothing less than the number of humans on this planet. This is the population of humans, and you can see that it wasn't all that much until lately. But let's focus in on this part here. Let's focus in on that part there, right? So that's billions of people. So if I zoom in on this, there's a change. Look at that, it's kind of going a little bit up, but now it really kicks up. What happened during that time? What happened is a very important chemical reaction became easy to do, or a lot easier. Okay? And the process that enabled that is called the Haber-Bosch process. But it is what allowed us to feed billions of people.
Our transparent atmosphere reveals itself when it starts to move. Moving air, of course, is wind. The atmosphere surrounding us is a deep ocean of air extending for kilometers above us. We know that the atmosphere is essential to life on Earth. The components of air, particularly oxygen and carbon dioxide, play a critical role in the chemistry of life. Another important aspect of air is atmospheric pressure. We live at the bottom of an ocean of air. Gravity pulls on this massive layer of gas, creating pressure.
50% of every protein you put in your body, 50% comes from this. Comes from some plant that was grown using this process. That's how important it is.
I'm calling you up to get it down, down, down. The way that we touch is never enough. Turning you up.
The pressure is greatest at the bottom, the Earth's surface, the level where we live. Pressure is a force per unit area. The standard SI unit of pressure is the Pascal. 1 Pascal is 1 Newton of force per square meter. You will also find PSI, or pounds per square inch, used in parts of the world, particularly America. Air pressure at sea level is 14.7 PSI, or 101.3 kilopascals. That's over 101,000 newtons of force per square meter. If you have a small kitchen table, 1 meter square, the force in that area created by air pressure is approximately 101,000 newtons, equivalent to the weight of 10 cars sitting on the tabletop. If air pressure can generate such huge forces, why don't we notice it? Why doesn't the table collapse? Turns out that pressure in a fluid like air transmits in all directions, not just down. This means that the 101,000 newtons of force pushing down on the tabletop is balanced by 101,000 newtons pushing up. Forces are balanced. Similarly, our bodies are not crushed because the fluids contained within our skin exert a pressure that balances atmospheric pressure.
Layna live mix.
The new 5G frequencies will allow instant connections to billions of devices. But meteorologists' satellites also use some of those frequencies to measure things like water vapour, rain, snow, atmospheric temperature, cloud and ice. Water vapour, for instance, emits a natural signal at 23.8 GHz, so satellites use that to monitor weather systems. But some of the 5G frequencies already sold off to networks are very close to 23.8 GHz, which could interfere with critical weather data.
Here is a simple demonstration that reveals the presence of atmospheric pressure. Fill a glass with water. Cut a small piece of card large enough to cover the top of the glass. Lay the card on the glass. Hold the card in place and rotate the glass full of water. Surprisingly, the water stays in the glass. Here's the explanation. The card provides a rigid membrane between the water and the air in the room. Air pressure pushes up on the card. Air pressure is not pushing down on the water because there is a vacuum at the top of the water. Air pressure is pushing on the outside of the glass, but this does not affect the water. The only downward force from the water is its weight. The upward force of air pressure easily supports the weight of the water. If we drilled a hole in the top of the glass, air pressure would push on the top of the water would fall from the glass.
My soul is not contained within the limits of my body. My body is contained within the limitlessness of my soul. One unified field.
Around the beginning of the 19th century, population started to grow faster thanks to the Industrial Revolution. But it was hard to grow enough food. Harvests are unpredictable and could take months to renew for the next planting. It became clear to scientists that nitrogen was the key ingredient for growing crops. In nature, when plants die, the nitrogen they contain returns to the soil and new ones grow using it. But agriculture disrupts that cycle.
Our eyes are not viewers, they are also projectors that are running a second story over the picture that we see in front of us all the time. Fear is writing that script.
So farmers started using manure and compost which contained nitrogen, but it was never enough.
It's 500 million tons of nitrogen is made this way every year.
How do you fly so high without a special breathing apparatus?
How much do I have? Well, we know how much the atmosphere weighs, it turns out.
In the few minutes you have spent watching this video, your body has been quietly using air pressure to move air in and out of your lungs. The diaphragm, a muscular membrane below your lungs, alternately contracts and relaxes, changing the volume of the body cavity, which changes internal pressure. Low pressure allows air at atmospheric pressure to move down the trachea into the lungs. High pressure forces it out. Without atmospheric pressure, we could not breathe. Atmospheric pressure also plays a role in the function of many devices, including water pumps, syringes, and drinking straws. When you use a drinking straw, you're not sucking liquid up the tube, air pressure pushes the liquid up the tube.
Well, it's just counting. 1 mole of ammonia is 17 grams. Oh, we're doing the same thing. How did I know that? Periodic table. That's how I knew that.
We must do it now before humanity is so overtaken by some disaster that we can neither anticipate nor control.
Our Earth is not a dead body. It's alive.
Above South America, a weak spot in Earth's magnetic field is evolving. Called the South Atlantic Anomaly, this unique region has been expanding for more than a decade.
Our Earth is a big living body, just like our body. We need healthy. Earth also needs healthy. But our Earth now is weak. Earth is in pain. The reason is from us, our human society. We have two main problems. First, our humans have too much greed.
Layna live mix.
Too much desire. We take in too much things, too much natural resources from our Earth. It is damaged and hurt our Earth, especially now.
When the solar storm reaches our planet, something strange happens. An invisible shield, the Earth's magnetic field, deflects the storm. The magnetic fields couple together and create a funnel where the gas streams down on the daylight side of the pole. This is the daylight aurora. The magnetic fields stretch further back and couple together. The magnetic rubber band breaks, and gas from the solar storm streams along the magnetic lines towards the poles on the night side. This is the nighttime aurora.
Here is a cell, the basic unit of all living tissue. In most human cells, there is a structure called the nucleus. The nucleus contains the genome. In humans, the genome is split between 23 pairs of chromosomes. Each chromosome contains a long strand of DNA, tightly packaged around proteins called histones. Within the DNA are sections called genes. These genes contain the instructions for making proteins. When a gene is switched on, an enzyme called RNA polymerase attaches to the start of the gene. It moves along the DNA, making a strand of messenger RNA out of 3 bases in the nucleus.
The magnetic fields couple together and create a funnel where the gas streams down on the daylight side of the pole. This is the daylight aurora.
The DNA code determines the order in which the 3 bases are added to the messenger RNA. This process is called transcription. Before the messenger RNA can be used as a template for the production of proteins, it needs to be processed. This involves removing and adding sections of RNA. The messenger RNA then moves out of the nucleus into the cytoplasm. Protein factories in the cytoplasm, called ribosomes, bind to the messenger RNA. The ribosome reads the code in the messenger RNA to produce a chain made up of amino acids. there are 20 different types of amino acid. Transfer RNA molecules carry the amino acids to the ribosome. The messenger RNA is read 3 bases at a time. As each triplet is read, a transfer RNA delivers the corresponding amino acid. This is added to a growing chain of amino acids. Once the last amino acid has been added, the chain folds into a complex 3D shape to form the protein.
Our Earth is a big living body, just like our body. We need healthy. Earth also needs healthy. But our Earth now is weak.
50% of every protein you put in your body, 50% comes from this. Comes from some plant that was grown using this process. That's how important it is.
Earth is in pain. The reason is from us, our human society. We have 2 main problems. First, our humans have too much greed.
The Sun and Earth both emit electromagnetic radiation. Electromagnetic radiation is energy that travels in the form of electromagnetic waves. Different types of electromagnetic waves carry different amounts of energy. The shorter the wavelength, the more energy carried by the wave. The wavelength of emitted radiation is determined by the temperature of the object it comes from. The higher the temperature, the shorter the wavelength of emitted radiation. The Sun, with its high surface temperature, emits a great deal of high-energy, short wavelength radiation. Energy emitted by the Sun is also referred to as solar, or shortwave radiation. Most of solar radiation is the visible light we see with our eyes, but it also includes wavelengths that we cannot see, like the ultraviolet light that causes sunburn. The Earth, however, being much cooler than the Sun, emits lower energy, longer wavelength radiation. Energy emitted by the Earth is also referred to as terrestrial, which means land-based, or long-wave radiation. Although we cannot see long-wave radiation with our eyes, we detect it as heat. In summary, the types of radiation emitted by the Sun and the Earth are determined by their temperatures. The Sun, which is very hot, emits high-energy, shortwave radiation, while the Earth, which is much cooler, emits lower-energy, long-wave radiation.
In 1982, Richard Skrenta, when he was a 15-year-old high school student, was sick of people taking his discs and borrowing his discs, and so he basically wrote a program called the ELK cloner that would copy itself onto the computer, and then it would copy itself onto discs that were injected into the computer. Basically, it would boot up the 50th time, it would give you this warning, this little poem, and it was really highly infectious. In fact, it was the first really infectious computer virus that was ever written. And so the program was able to move from computer to computer to computer. If there's no computer, then there's no computer virus. And so viruses work the same way. These right here are bacteriophages. And basically what they do is they inject their DNA into a bacteria. They use the machinery of the bacteria to make copies of themselves. In other words, they're going to make copies of the DNA. They're then going to take the DNA to make messenger RNA and then make proteins. And then those proteins are going to enclose the DNA, and then they're going to disperse, and they're going to move to another bacteria. And so viruses spread using cells. If there's no cell, just like if there's no computer, then there's no virus. And that's why we don't classify them as alive. They definitely have elements of living things, but they don't have metabolism, they don't have reproduction on their own without a cell to inject it in. And so basically, it's important to study viruses because they're one of the main sites of diseases that we have. In other words, millions of people were killed by the influenza outbreak on the heels of World War I. The 1918 influenza virus, this is a reproduction of what that virus looked like, or herpes virus, or polio virus, or look at all these viruses over here that infect us. And so basically, if it weren't for our cells, they couldn't make copies of themselves. So where did viruses come from? Well, probably you'll never know the right answer to this, but here's a few theories. There's the cellular theory that they used to be part of cells, and so a plasmid, for example, is given off by bacteria, can be picked up by other bacteria, and so maybe they started that way, or maybe they were full-on cells that regress. So chlamydia, for example, is a type of cell that's lost the ability to live on its own, and so now it's an obligate parasite. Or it could have been coevolution, that these viruses were evolving with cells, just like insects and plants were evolving together. This is a little viroid, which is a little bit of RNA plant virus. And so there's evidence to suggest that any of these theories could have produced that first virus, but nonetheless, we eventually have viruses. So what are some characteristics in the structure of a virus? Well, all viruses are going to have nucleic acids, and they have to have some kind of genetic material. Sometimes that is DNA, and sometimes that is RNA.
You are listening to the best tracks selected by DJ Layna.
In order to have a better understanding of what actually happens in Earth's atmosphere, we want to take another look at the various layers in the atmosphere and at the temperature gradients we find in each of the layers in the atmosphere. We have basically four predominant layers. Near the Earth's surface, we have the troposphere. Above that, we have the stratosphere. Above that, we have the mesosphere. And then at the very top, we have what we call the thermosphere, a section of that which is called the ionosphere, because that's where a lot of molecules are being ionized by the high energy radiation that reaches the Earth's atmosphere. Notice we see these lines going back and forth, and those lines are what we call the temperature gradients.
When the cloud of gases in the exosphere reflects the sun's UV light, it creates a luminosity, a glow that we can see called the geocorona. These new observations of the geocorona indicate that the exosphere may extend up to 630,000 kilometers away from Earth, a distance that includes the moon. So technically, the moon is in the Earth's atmosphere. This realization is thanks to an instrument called the Solar Wind Anisotropies Instrument, or SWAN. SWAN was able to measure and analyze the full extent of the geocorona, making us think about our atmosphere in a whole new way. See, sunlight interacts with the hydrogen atoms of the exosphere at a wavelength called Lyman alpha radiation, which is something astrophysicists can measure when looking at cosmological structures in deep space. Observing Lyman alpha radiation can tell us about the distribution of matter in space and help us think about how the universe expanded. It's also a wavelength that's absorbed by the inner layers of our atmosphere, so we can't observe it from Earth. But from Swan's position in space, it was able to see and measure both general Lyman alpha radiation and the geocorona, which extended far beyond what we were expecting. So while this discovery is remarkable in many ways, not the least of which is that technically no one has ever left Earth's atmosphere, it won't change space travel for us in most practical ways. It's far more important for informing the future of our observations of space. The new results also show that sunlight compresses the hydrogen atoms of the exosphere, producing pockets of denser geocorona with corresponding Lyman alpha radiation depending on the sun's position. So space telescopes that make measurements from within the confines of the exosphere will need to take a new Lyman alpha baseline level and the bunching of the geocorona into account when observing the night sky, hopefully letting us peer further and with greater accuracy. One last amazing thing about this piece of information is that this isn't even new research. These observations were made by Swan in the late 90s and were only just dug out of the archives for further analysis. What other startling discoveries could be lurking in a cupboard somewhere?
Right. But how do we answer this question? What's my question? My question is, how long can we keep going?